Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's InfraIntelligence discussion being presented by Renew Canada, Canada's source for information about the public sector infrastructure in Canada. My name is Andrew Macklin. I'm managing editor of Renew Canada, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation. Really excited to be discussing electrifying Canada's economy with four great speakers who we'll hear from in just a few moments. Before we bring them onto the screen, just want to take a few minutes to remind you that, yes, this is a fully interactive conversation. We do want you to participate in today's discussion. There are a few different ways to do that. First of all, I invite you to take a few moments to join us in the chat and tell everyone who you are, where you're from, what you represent. Just take a few moments. So that way there's an opportunity to interact with some of your colleagues here in the industry. If at any time you do find that the chat is a little distracting, if you go to the top right-hand corner of the chat, you'll see a little down arrow. If you click on that, that will minimize the chat, and to be able to bring it back up again, you just need to click on the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see along the bottom there are a few different options for you to be able to get involved in today's conversation. First of all, the polls section. We are asking a few general polls of everyone who is participating today. Some of that information will be used in some of our post-event deliverables, which includes a feature article on this subject that will be presented in the January-February edition of Renew Canada. Also, you'll see the Ask a Question tab. That is the tab that allows you to ask a question of our speakers at any point during today's conversation. As moderator for today's discussion, I will be monitoring the questions, so I will make sure that if you have a question that is appropriate to the discussion, that we do bring it into our conversation. You'll also see throughout the presentation, as you just saw, a little Renew Canada green tab just appeared below me. Throughout today's conversation, we'll have live links to the websites for some of our speakers. That way it gives you an opportunity to look at their own company websites, organizational websites, to see some of the great industry work that they are all doing. So once again, invite you to please be active in today's conversation. Ask questions of any of the speakers we have. We do have an excellent lineup here today. And without further ado, let's start introducing our speakers for today's event. So first of all, we have Robert Hornung. Robert is the president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, launched in July of this year as a unified organization whose vision is to ensure wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage play a central role in transforming Canada's energy mix. Prior to taking on the role, Robert had been the president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association from 2003 to 2020, and he's also held senior roles at the Pembina Institute and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And our second speaker is Patrick Bateman. Patrick is the interim president at WaterPower Canada. Patrick is a renewable electricity professional who has worked for a decade in federal and provincial level public and regulatory affairs in Canada. In his role as acting president of WaterPower Canada, he represents the largest electricity sector in Canada, promoting the many attributes of water power and the fundamental role it plays in the fight against climate change. Patrick has stepped away from his role as vice president of government relations and regulatory affairs with WaterPower Canada to act as president, while Anne Raphael Audouin is on maternity leave. Prior to joining WaterPower Canada, Patrick led solar energy, energy storage, and smart grid advocacy initiatives in Canada and supported public and private organizations with energy and environmental initiatives in England. Good morning, Patrick.
Hey, Andrew.
Keith Soanes is the Executive Vice President of Ontario Operations at Valard Construction. Keith is a senior electric transmission and distribution industry executive with extensive experience in project management, operational leadership, safety management, and critical thinking. More than 3 decades in the industry have led to a solid understanding of high-value customer service. Prior to joining Valard, Keith was the president of Alltech Line Contractors based in Langley, BC, and also served as a corporate safety manager at BC Hydro. And last but not least, Kevin Palmer Wilson. Kevin is a research associate at the University of Victoria. Kevin is a member of the team at the 2060 Project, researches Western Canada's long-term energy scenarios. His focus lies on electricity system modeling and optimization and techno-economic resource assessments with uncertainty analysis. Kevin employs multi-threaded linear programming, GIS, and a suite of data analysis tools to investigate land area impacts of the low-carbon energy transition, as well as the potential energy production and costs from geothermal resources. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me for today's conversation. Greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And it's great to see in our chat that we have people from all across Canada joining us for today's discussion. So let's jump in with a, I think, very simple question that might be a lot more complex than it might be on the surface. And that is to look at our current electrical production. Do we have enough clean energy assets right now to meet our current demands throughout the country? Focus on clean energy. Do we have enough clean energy assets in Canada right now? Robert, I'm going to start with you if I could.
Sure. I'm very happy to be here on this esteemed panel here this morning. Well, my take on that question would be to say Canada is in an incredibly fortunate position. We already have one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world. 81% of our electricity comes from a mix of non-emitting sources, hydro being dominant, but also nuclear and wind and solar all contributing. But the important thing about Canada is that gives us a great foundation to start from. But we have a tremendous amount of untapped clean energy resources in all of those areas, whether it's hydropower in terms of refurbishment, which Patrick will talk about, or new facilities. A lot of untapped wind and solar potential. We have marine renewables that are being piloted in different parts of the country right now. So we have an abundance of resources that really puts us in a position to be not only to clean our electricity system so that it's 100% clean, but also to expand that system going forward, which is very important in the context of this conversation around electrification.
Patrick, your thoughts?
Thanks, Andrew. I agree very much with Robert, and maybe I'll just approach the question in a slightly different way to be able to add. And I think if we're looking at, if the question is, do we have enough clean electricity supply now to meet all of our demand, I think what immediately comes to my mind is that electricity represents about 20% of our total energy demand. 80% is currently met with fossil fuels. So as Robert mentioned, our electricity system is currently very clean, and we've got a lot more electricity resources that we can develop. But we've got a long way to go before electricity and clean electricity takes up a majority part or the single largest part of our energy supply. So very good foundation with our electric system, a lot of untapped resources, but a lot of demand that could be met.
Keith, from a contractor perspective, do you believe that there are enough clean energy assets to be able to meet current demands? I mean, certainly you're building some of the new clean energy assets that we need here in Ontario.
Yeah, it's you mentioned earlier, Andrew. By the way, my apologies for the introduction. Right when I clicked the link, my screen went blank and I had a mild panic attack. So we're back online. You mentioned earlier that it was perhaps a more complex question than anticipated, and I would agree with that. I think the answer is a yes and no. If you aggregate the amount of energy resources we have, as Robert indicated, we've got an abundance of energy. It's also regionally trapped in many cases because the infrastructure across the country doesn't allow the transference of power from one end to the other. We've got more connections going north and south with our neighbors to the south than we do east-west. So although we have a lot of energy available, it's not necessarily available where it's needed.
Gotcha. Kevin?
Yeah, I agree with my previous speakers that Canada's in a very fortunate position that we do have a large supply of clean sources of energy. But just for comparison, if we were to electrify heating fully, that would add to our clean electricity demand quite considerably. And right now in British Columbia, we're using about 24 terawatt hours a year for commercial and residential space heating. And for comparison, we generate about 60 terawatt hours low carbon electricity here in BC. So that's 1/3 of our electricity demand will be added if we were to fully electrify that heat demand that is currently being served by fossil fuels. So while we have those energy resources in place or available geographically, harnessing those and adding those to the existing system is certainly a challenge.
Now, we're in a situation still in Canada where we have 4 provinces that are employing some use of coal at some level. And I'm just wondering, for those provinces, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, New Brunswick, do we already have plans in place from what you're seeing from the provincial associations, the provincial utility bodies? Are we seeing those plans already developing to eliminate all that coal production, knowing that this federal government has demanded that coal generation be removed by 2030? Feel free to jump in, whoever would like to start us off on that one.
Well, I can start if you want. It's I think it's a very Canadian story in that each province is unique in that regard. Let's start off with Alberta, for example. I mean, Alberta, it's not going to be a product of sort of government direction. It's going to be a product of where the market takes things, with the way the Alberta electricity market is structured. I think they're actually well on track to the phase out of coal. The question in Alberta will be, to what extent is gas used to replace that coal relative to other sources of generation? And I think that's still an economic question that a lot of players in that market are wrestling with to try and determine and figure out. Saskatchewan has done a lot of planning around how to move away from coal. I wouldn't say they're finished yet in terms of figuring out what the mix will be, but they're looking at a range of options. They're looking at increased of imports of hydroelectricity from Manitoba. They've been talking about small modular reactors. They have been increasing their build out of renewables. So again, they're well on track. Nova Scotia is right now going through an integrated resource planning process, which is meant to help provide, I guess, the final sort of insights to allow them to get there, because I would say they're not clear yet exactly how they're going to get to where they need to be in 2030. And I think New Brunswick is sort of in that same zone as well. So I'd say in the Prairie provinces, they're a little farther ahead. But in the Atlantic provinces, they're certainly working very hard to look at the full range of options available.
And it's interesting, just for a second, if I can build on what you say, it's interesting you talk about the natural gas mix, because you look at the 2 largest energy projects that are underway in Alberta, and one, the $1.5 billion Cascade Power project, natural gas. But on the flip side, you've also got the $500 million Traverse Solar project, which is one of the largest solar projects we've ever seen here in Canada. So you're right, it is interesting to see where that balance is coming in Alberta. And in Saskatchewan, they have done quite a bit of work developing new natural gas assets, but we aren't seeing the kind of large scale renewable assets yet that we've seen right next door in Alberta.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just to respond quickly to that, I think both of those provinces sit on abundant natural gas resources, and so clearly that's going to be an obvious consideration for them to look at. And I think in Alberta it's a little different, because it's private investors who are going to make that call, sort of looking ahead and saying, do I think the market is going to support this? Do I think that a gas plant is going to be able to run for another 25 years? Are the carbon prices going up, et cetera? So there's a lot of factors that investors have to consider as they're looking at where to put their dollars right now.
Right. Patrick, I mean, certainly some hydroelectric opportunities potentially in any of those 4 provinces, or is this a case of where that hydroelectric capacity really isn't there to be able to support the coal transition?
Well, certainly, I think I'll bring it back up to quite a high level again. And what I'll say is that we've established already that Canada is uniquely positioned to lead on electrification. Canada is also uniquely positioned to reach 100% or near 100% non-emitting electricity in the world. If we look at the OECD nations, we're in the top 6 for the penetration of renewables in our electricity supply. And of all those top 6, they all receive at least 60% or more from hydropower. So a base of hydropower is very important, and I'll explain why. Especially reservoir hydropower. Within the reservoirs, you've got a lot of long duration energy storage for months or seasons, or in some cases years. The assets are very flexible in the way that they generate. They can ramp up and ramp down very, very quickly. And they also provide a whole swathe of different ancillary services as well. And those three different things are very complementary to variable renewables such as wind and solar. So if we look at the concentrations of coal, for example, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the prairies have excellent wind and solar resources. They also benefit from being sandwiched between BC and Manitoba as well, with enormous available hydropower. So marrying those three things can get us very far toward the phase out of coal. Likewise, in Atlantic Canada, a very similar story with Quebec and Labrador, and then that demand in Atlantic Canada.
Right. Keith, Kevin, anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, so the key to integrating renewables into the grid is obviously balancing supply and demand. And with the big hydro provinces next to Saskatchewan and Alberta, that's certainly a possibility. And one of my good colleagues, Jeff English, did some modeling on whether we should expand cooperation between the provinces. And that's actually a key part. It reduces costs to integrate renewables on both sides. For example, in British Columbia, the hydro system has larger inflows in the summertime, but in Alberta, in that great prairie province, the wind is better for higher capacity factors, which means that in the wintertime, when there's more wind, we can balance out that hydro supply that comes in the summertime, and vice versa. So the cooperation between the provinces is really important, is really key to integrating this. The electrified economy. And in order to do that, expanding the transmission line, which currently is stronger north to south than it is east to west, is a key part to making this happen.
Keith, is there anything you want to add?
Just to extend that point, there are a number of parts of the economy in Canada that are reliant, obviously, on growing electrical needs. We do a lot of work in the north with First Nations, with mining companies, with development companies, and there are actually a lot of those organizations now that are looking to either stifle growth or not grow at all, or not develop at all, simply because of the absence of electricity. And quite honestly, payroll is the second for a lot of the mining operations. Payroll is the second highest cost. Electricity is the first, primarily because they're reliant on imported diesel. So the opportunities that exist are significant, but we do have to understand we're looking at a national economy and not just a regional set of economies.
Right. So are there any concerns over the current state of our renewable energy assets, or are the resources there to continue their rehabilitation so they can be used decades to come? I know, Patrick, I actually threw this question in more for you because I know that when you and I have had discussions, and when I've had discussions with Anne Raphael, we've been talking about, there's quite a bit of rehabilitation in the hydroelectric sector ongoing across Canada. And perhaps there's a bit of a missed opportunity there, because if we had, knowledge of what was going to come next, perhaps we'd be adding power to that rehabilitation. But is the current plan for rehabilitation of hydroelectric assets, then Robert, I'm going to look to you as far as solar and wind assets, is the money there to continue to rehabilitate these assets so that they can become viable and continue to be so for decades to come?
Very, very interesting question, Andrew, and I'll respond in two parts. I'll just mention what the opportunity is, and then maybe comment on kind of whether the conditions for success are there. So, with respect to the opportunity, if the existing hydropower fleet were operated for just about 1.5 or 2% more every year, we could electrify all light-duty vehicles in Canada. that's the extent of the asset base that we have here. If we can squeeze a little bit more out, it can go a very, very far away. The other kind of underlying feature is that the average age of a hydropower generation station in Canada is something like 55 years. And around about this point in their lives, they're due for, in some cases, significant investment, or at least investment to extend their lifetime. When those investments are being made, there's a lot of opportunities to, at a minimum, increase efficiency. In some cases, increase generation capacity quite materially. So there's an enormous opportunity for during the next 10 to 20 years to yield that opportunity. In addition to the additional electricity generation, the jobs, the investment, it's an enormous opportunity for the infrastructure sector. And then to the next part of the response, then are the underlying conditions for success present? I think they're getting better. I think having long-term climate change targets that lay out how much clean energy we're going to need in the decades ahead is really needed when the investments are multi-decade investments. Signals from emissions regulations like the Clean Fuel Standard, like carbon pricing, are also creating some of the near-term conditions as well. But that being said, it's not easy. They're getting better. Are they perfect today to maximize that investment? The answer is not yet.
Okay, Robert.
Yeah, well, I mean, the great thing, obviously, about renewable resources is that as the technology nears the end of its lifespan, the resource is still there. And for wind and solar in Canada, I mean, these are still relatively young installations that aren't at the end of their lifespan. So, but what we look around the world and we see what's happening in Europe, for example, where these technologies have been in place for a longer time, we see a significant amount of what's called repowering going on, which is a situation where, for example, you would take an existing wind farm, you would take down those turbines, you'd replace them with modern turbines, and with the massive advances we've seen in technology over time, what we're seeing in Europe a lot of the time is that you can produce, when you repower, you can use half the number of turbines and produce 3 times the power, and it's cheaper. So there's a tremendous amount of untapped opportunity, not necessarily even just in exploiting new sort of resources, because there's a lot of untapped there, but just in terms of repowering and making better use of existing resources going forward. So, and I think the outlook for that is good if the demand is there, because these opportunities come with lower cost power. These technologies have actually become more competitive over time. That I think these technologies are actually very well positioned to help to meet those growing demands going forward when the need emerges.
Mm-hmm. Keith?
Yeah, the entire electrical grid, and this speaks to Patrick's earlier point, the cost of refurbishment of a lot of these legacy assets, these large generating stations, for example, could be nuclear or hydro, or even gas, it costs an awful lot of money. So the question is, do you invest that amount of cash into refurbishing an existing asset, and hopefully you can get more power out of it, as Patrick mentioned, or do you follow the role of Europe and take a look at reestablishing and relocating solar and wind assets so that they can be more strategically, I guess, located to deliver power where it's needed? The entire grid was built around the concept of large generating assets that were remote from the population, for the most part. I think we have to rethink that entire thing. There's a lot of money that has to be spent, and we're at a crossroads right now in terms of how to best spend it.
Kevin, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Just information on why repowering is such a valuable approach to producing more electricity. The reason being that historically, when we started installing, especially wind farms, of course we chose the best locations, the windiest sites, and those technologies have obviously improved considerably since ever since the 1980s when wind started taking off, and those lower productivity turbines are now located in the best sites. So repowering that can use fewer turbines, better technology to make use of an environment that we've already designated toward electricity generation without having to designate new areas.
Interesting on the hydroelectric refurbishment front, and the as you were talking about the incredible cost involved. We saw a major announcement yesterday coming out of Hydro-Quebec with their announcement of the refurbishment at Carillon generating station. 6 of their 14 generating units are being
I think we lost Andrew.
Temporarily, it would seem so.
I'm trying to think if I can anticipate what his question was going to be so I could respond, but I didn't hear enough.
Can you provide more insight on the announcement, Patrick?
Not a great deal, Robert. Just the contract was awarded for a fairly significant
refurbished. Of course, because my great team at Renew Canada had posted.
Yeah, so it's an example of one of the many refurbishment projects that we're seeing coming. A lot of these projects have been fully studied. All of the assessments and things have been done over the years, and there's a lot of them across the country just ready to go once the investment conditions are correct and as they align with capital plans. So this project in particular,
$150 million.
Hopefully Andrew will be back with us again shortly. Yeah, so some of the benefits of projects like this are that you do have a lot of the civil infrastructure in place. So when the refurbishment is just taking place within the powerhouse, there's no incremental environmental footprint, for example, because it all takes place within the existing infrastructure. You're taking advantage of existing transmission. In many cases, you're getting more power out just because of that modernization. Energy and capacity is one important part of it, but another very interesting space for investment within this kind of refurbishment and redevelopment space for hydropower at the moment is investing in digitalization and flexibility. So as more and more wind and solar assets come online, also as consumer behavior changes and there's opportunities to do more behind the meter as well, we're seeing a need for these older assets to behave in ways that they weren't designed, and integration with the Internet of Things and other kind of more modern digital technologies is enabling them to be to perform with a greater level of control. Robert, is digitalization and flexibility a space within the wind industry that you're seeing investment in at the moment?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole sort of Internet of Things discussion, smart grid, all sort of key elements, I guess, within each of these individual technologies, but more importantly, in terms of how they interlink and how they interact. And as we see energy storage, for example, moving forward and growing both in front of the meter and behind the meter, see more demand response initiatives coming forward in terms of smart grid technologies. We have an opportunity, I think, through the advancement of these technologies to make the grid so much more efficient going forward. And that, I think, offers tremendous potential to, given the scale of the change that's required, we clearly want to minimize costs to the extent we can, which really puts a premium on efficiency. And I think what we're seeing in the electricity sector is a tremendous sort of blooming and diversification of options that are available to provide all of the services that we need to maintain a reliable grid. And I think our challenge is going to be to try and ensure, can we put in place the structures that allow all of those to compete so that we get the best possible outcomes coming out of that. And I'm optimistic that that's the case. There's obviously a lot of work going on to rethink electricity markets to enable that. And I think we'll be surprised at how far we can go with the diverse suite of technologies. It's not a one technology solution. It's going to be everything contributing together. Welcome back, Andrew, I hope.
Keith, how about you within the transmission space and within the grid space, digitalization, what's happening and what's the potential?
It's a great question. And we really, I guess, evaluate the market by being often the recipient of a number of different tenders, proposals, requests for qualifications, that kind of thing. And we're definitely seeing a shift. Everything from automating traffic signals in urban centers to how to integrate battery storage in remote areas and on First Nations reserves. So there's a great trend in that direction. And the other piece of that, and Robert mentioned it a little while ago, is the communication that's necessary. Whether you're going to add the Internet of Things, it's really designing the system, and our engineering group is now spending increasing time on this. How do you design a system that allows all of these different pieces to be integrated, and the economies of scale to be maximized, as well as the efficiencies? Because on a one-off basis, we'll go out there and we'll execute some design work or construct something for a client that will serve their facility, but then we're getting more and more interest from national players about how do we take railways, for example, and make sure that they're the beneficiaries of a lot of this digitization. What do you do with respect to old substations that are legacy in a downtown core, and they're underserving the population? How do you still use that, but not in the conventional way? So yes, there's a significant motion in the digitization space.
I think digitalization is actually a huge opportunity for us researchers as well. When we see that with smart meters in the electricity grid that collect data at a very high resolution, and just recently we were able to reproduce what a heat demand would look like if we were to fully electrify our province. And having that data is absolutely key to understanding what our electricity system will look like in the future if we fully electrify. And in areas where that data is not available, if that in some other cases, data is only collected on a daily or even monthly basis with the analog meters, it's really hard to understand how customer behavior is going to impact our electricity grid. And we see that customers that use electricity for heating behave differently from those that use natural gas for heating. And that is certainly a challenge that we have to solve in order to do planning for our system and then anticipate how much generation capacity we're actually going to need. And that is, digitization is key to making that planning available.
Gentlemen, do we have me back yet?
Yes.
You do? Yeah. Okay, good. It's a new one for me, guys. I've seen a lot of things go wrong in an online presentation. I've never seen the moderator disappear before. This is a new one even for me. Yeah, totally not what I expected. Thank you, Patrick, and everyone for carrying the conversation without me. I greatly appreciate it. So I want to talk about the government of Canada and kind of what some of the indicators are from them right now. So we have heard the government of Canada is undergoing a green shift. This is what they have told us they want to do, but they haven't really given us a ton of direction as to what that looks like. And I know, Patrick, I reference you once again, because I know I've had several conversations with you and Raphael and your team over the last several months. And I know that back when you guys were part of a conversation that we had back in February, one of the things that came up was that, for things like adding megawatts to a refurbishment project, you need a clear indication from the federal government that, yes, we are making a transition to electrification. And we haven't seen that yet. And I'm just wondering from everyone, from all of our panelists, what is the true impact of what this is doing to the energy sector right now, not having that clear indication from the government of Canada that part of this green shift that they keep talking about involves electrification of all of our assets, transportation sector being a big one of those. Patrick, maybe you want to kick that off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there's probably a long list of different things that we can talk about. So I'll maybe just start with one, and if there's an opportunity to add a second at the end, I will. So I think if we think about what the federal government has done to spur on investment in clean electricity infrastructure, I think that the starting point for the discussion always has to be the coal phase out. The coal phase out in the absence of load growth. Load has been relatively flat over the last 10, 15 years. There's really limited opportunities for new investment, except when old assets need to be replaced with new ones. So the coal phase out has created supply gaps in parts of the country where the next asset that replaces it is going to be clean and green. So that's created an enormous opportunity. So that's the first thing that I would reference.
Yeah, I can maybe build on that. I mean, I think I think that's one area where I think we can say the federal government has sent some clear signals that you've seen responses to in terms of the coal phase out. In terms of carbon pricing, new natural gas plants under the federal carbon pricing regime do have higher exposure to carbon pricing than existing plants, for example, which sends a signal that, is this something I want to invest in or not? So in terms of the supply mix itself, I mean, I think those signals can be strengthened, but there's some initial things there. In terms of electrification, however, we're still at the level of talking about sort of the climate change outcomes we want to achieve in 2030 and 2050. We know that every bit of analysis that's been done says the only way you get to those sorts of outcomes is through significant increases in electrification. But the initiatives that actually would drive that electrification in transport, in industry, in buildings, so far are not there. And I think Patrick's absolutely right when he says, we've got a situation right now where part of the reason we're not actually seeing a lot of investment in new generation is there's just no demand for it. And that demand is either going to come from through electrification or around the world, what's driving investment in renewables is the phase out of fossil fuels in the grid. Because we're 80% clean already, that's a smaller opportunity in Canada. The other thing that's driving that sort of investment around the world is corporate procurement and customer choice, where you see the Googles, the GMs, the Johnson & Johnsons making commitments to go 100% renewable in terms of their power and actually signing contracts to do that. And in Canada, because of the way our electricity markets are structured, that's actually very challenging to do anywhere outside of Alberta, which stands up as a bit of a barrier again to sort of seeing this momentum build and go forward. So electrification is absolutely key to capitalizing on this opportunity, but for that we need some clear milestones, like we're talking about with emissions. By 2050 we want to be here, by 2030 we want to be here. We need similar sort of milestones out there for electrification as well in different sectors that people can then start to plan around and build towards.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly echo that sentiment. The clarity that's necessary is something that investors of all kinds take a strong look at before they start deciding where to put dollars. And some jurisdictions have greater clarity, others less so. There's certainly no question that the signals have been appropriate. The greening of the economy, the electrification of the other 80%, that's not just the grid. Those are all very strong directions, but that absence of clarity does create an impediment for investors. The other piece of that, and this is something that governments, not just the federal government, but all governments can weigh in on, are the regulations that allow certain activities to occur or not occur. So as Robert just mentioned, if you've got a corporation, large or small, that wants to get a power purchase agreement with a renewable energy generator, how do you go about doing that when you've got tacit agreement on both ends, the generator and the receiver, but everything in the mix, including the regulations that allow the transference of that power, are kind of up in the air or antiquated. So I think that's something that needs to be really revamped, and it can be done, but it just needs to be done.
Kevin, I know you and your team have done some work on this, especially in the transportation sector.
That's true. But I actually want to comment on what our goal or our role is as scientists. And what we try to do is we try to show pathways forward to give the decision makers the opportunity to make the right decisions for our country as a whole, for our society. And the evidence that we see right now, investments in natural gas to replace some of the coal in Alberta, points to the fact that the regulation or the policies in place right now aren't sufficient to actually get us to the 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade goal. We've all seen the charts where the global greenhouse gas emissions have to decline rapidly. And investing in an asset that has a 25, 30 year, 40 year lifetime right now is really it's a lock-in into a certain technology. And if we make that decision as a society, then we've chosen a path that we're going to have trouble getting away from if in 20 years down the road we see that we may not reach our targets. And I think that those market investments are a good indicator of whether we're doing enough to actually reach our climate targets.
If I could just build on that, just to say that I think it's an incredibly important point when we think about the important role electricity is going to have to play. Electricity is a sector that is just full of long-lived infrastructure. And it's absolutely true. It really does drive home the fact that the decisions we make now, the words that we use, we're locked in. It's absolutely true. Every decision we take now it has the potential to eliminate options for action going forward. And so the more time we take to kind of get organized, in essence, the harder the challenge is going to be, because we'll be limiting our options going forward. Or we'll be doing things that are clearly uneconomic. So for example, saying we're going to shut down facilities before they get to the end of their economic life and things like that, which has its own sort of problems that come with that.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, you said you had another point you wanted to
add? Several. I'll pick one. So I mean, I think when we look at that the 80% of fossil fuel use, that goes to a lot of different end uses, and your question was, is the green shift being effective? So maybe I'll mention light duty vehicles again. The cost of electric vehicles has come down substantially. The range has gone up substantially. So electric vehicles, I think, is one big part of the next step that we can take. Personal vehicles have an asset turnover rate of about, I think it's like once every 10 or 11 years. So we're talking about gas plants or electricity infrastructure that's there for 40 years once you've built it. But cars and things can turn over much quicker. So I would say that a great way to reduce greenhouse gases in the near term is to focus some policy and attention on light duty vehicles. And we've seen incentives drive demand at the federal level, sometimes in combination with provincial incentives. Some provinces have zero emissions vehicle legislation requiring that ZEVs make up a certain percentage of sales each year. The federal government is currently looking at that as well. So I think that personal vehicle space is going to be an important part of the electrification story in the near term. It's an easier nut to crack than some of the other bigger pieces.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, going back to your point about vehicles, we did at least see one recent announcement supporting from the federal government, supporting investment as part of the $10 billion growth plan that we heard announced by the Canada Infrastructure Bank a couple of weeks ago. $1.5 billion of that $10 billion investment towards zero emission vehicles. And I know, certainly from previous discussions we've had over the past 6 months with some of the big city mayors across Canada, you hear mayors like Don Iveson in Edmonton who are clamoring for this kind of investment in zero emission vehicles. We've seen that the TTC is in the process of, trying to do a long-term procurement that involves zero emission vehicles. So certainly the demand is there, even on the municipal side, to be able to push towards that. I'm going to break from our conversation for a minute or two, just because we have some great questions that have come in from the audience. I'm not sure who's going to be in the position to answer this one best, but if someone wants to jump in on this would be great. Site C hydroelectric project in BC. Costs are skyrocketing to the point where cost per kilowatt hour will exceed market when completed. Does the new BC government proceed with this project and ensure long-term electricity supply, or scrap it and eat the billions already invested? Now, just to give that a little context, of course, when John Horgan was elected and became premier in the minority government back in 2017, he said, hey, we don't like this project any more than many of you. However, almost $4 billion has been spent on this. We think it's the best use of taxpayer money to go ahead. He seems to be towing that line now, 2 days before their provincial election in British Columbia. I guess this is more of an opinion on this one than anything, whether or not that this is something that should go forward still at this stage. I can understand if any of you don't want to answer that, but if any of you do have an answer you want to put forward on that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Andrew. I might just add a comment. I don't think I can answer the question head on. That's a question for British Columbians and for the British Columbia government, the BC Hydro and others to answer. But I would just offer a different frame for people to view this project through. And a large part of the argument here as to why there needs to be reconsideration is that once complete, the cost will exceed market. So I'm just going to offer two other variables here to kind of just consider that frame. The first one is that wholesale electricity prices are a part, but not all, of the total electricity cost. In addition to the wholesale electricity price, you need to layer on top capacity costs, ancillary services, whether it's spinning reserves or frequency regulation, so on. As I mentioned earlier on, reservoir hydro offers all of those things in spades. So the cost of 1 kilowatt hour is only a small part of the total value stack. So I think it's very important that when we compare the cost of electricity from a project like Site C, we compare it to the right thing. So the price is one thing, the value is another. So that's very important. And then the second part is, I think, the timing. So we say the cost will be higher than market. That may be the case today, but will it be the case for the next 60 or 80 years? I think the answer is probably no. So we need to take into account that this is a long-term asset. So only considering it, for the next 6 months of this next year really misses a large part of the full analysis. So just offer those two things.
I'd like to add on Patrick's statement on value, because what we see when we model these electrification scenarios is that we have a need for more capacity, dispatchable capacity, so flexible generation that can be dispatched when there is a cold snap for 5 days and everybody cranks up their heating, and we see that electricity demand spikes. We know that there are certain technologies that are very efficient and can reduce our electricity demand overall on an annual basis. Heat pumps are great to be very efficient, but when it drops to -20 across BC, then these heat pumps actually aren't much more efficient than baseboard heating. And what that means is that in those few hours of the year, that peak capacity demand really spikes high. And this is where dispatchable generation is able to add considerable value in order to meet the electricity demand during those few times, and you can avoid building additional storage, which you might otherwise do. And there are a few renewable or low carbon generation technologies that can do that. Geothermal is dispatchable, hydro is dispatchable. We can theoretically sequester carbon dioxide from fossil fuel generation and use that for peaking capacity. But that's why it's important to look at the value of an asset that you invest in versus just the average electricity price. And we know that solar and wind are becoming extremely cheap, and that their average costs are now well below market prices in most jurisdictions. But those assets are not dispatchable, and they don't offer the same kind of value. And one more point I'd like to add is that at least in British Columbia, and the same is true in Quebec, the hydro system actually adds value to the province as a whole in terms of electricity export, not just exporting the raw terawatt hours, but actually providing services to the United States. So there's considerable revenue coming into the export arms of those provinces through offering what is called load shaping and load shifting to the United States, which is much higher paid than just the kilowatt hour. So that's why it's really important to know what you're comparing. And I don't want to say that Site C is a good or a bad thing. That's really up for our society to decide. But it's important when we make those investment decisions to look at what is the alternative. And in order to generate 1.1 gigawatt of peak capacity, we really don't have a lot of alternatives available at the moment that we can build right now if we do choose to electrify our heating and our transportation sectors.
Yeah, I might just jump into, and I also will say, yes, it's a decision for British Columbia government and British Columbians, and will not opine on that. But I do think it's actually indicative of something, which is that, I mean, the conversation about value is very important, and there's no doubt about it. And I mean, a lot of work that's going on in the wind and solar side now is looking at the opportunities to pair those technologies with energy storage. Variety of different technologies that are coming forward to ensure that it can provide greater value to the grid. But I think the comment I really wanted to make is when we're looking at major investments in any technology, and it's not to pick on hydro, it's on any technology, the rate of technological change is so rapid right now, and the range of alternatives that are emerging to provide some of these services, that, you know, when we take a decision today that says, yep, we're taking this decision because it's the best decision today to provide this value, there's a very good chance that within 10 years, there's going to be something else that would provide sort of that value as well, and perhaps with a competitive rate. And therefore, you know, I think the whole concept of whether we seek to build out our electricity system in an incremental fashion or in big clumps going forward, I think is going to be a very interesting discussion to have, because if you look at some of the projections that we're seeing in terms of where electricity demand is going to go, if we did not have electrification, I think most projections, so electricity demand is going to fall going forward as a result of improved efficiency. And even with things like electrification, electrification of vehicles is going to increase demand for electricity. It's going to decrease demand overall for energy, because electrification of transportation is more efficient than using internal combustion engines. So there's a lot of balls up in the air right now. And so any decision, whether it's a small investment or a big investment, does have a lot of variables that it has to consider right now. And I think, again, this comes back to the point that was raised earlier about the importance to provide as much clarity as we can in terms of policy signals and directions, so that, you know, investors are even if we provide clear policy, investors are going to have 100 different variables they're wrestling with and trying to guess. So let's try and minimize to the extent possible that uncertainty, so we get the best possible decisions.
I think it's also important to recognize the role of technology. As Robert mentioned, things are moving at a very, very rapid pace, but it's also key to think about when we've got these large legacy assets like a Site C or the other hydroelectric generation across Canada, how we use that. So, for example, if you've got increased density of electric vehicles in the neighborhood, what you really have are roving generators that can be used to power that neighborhood during the supper time peak. So if everybody comes home, plugs their car in at the same time, you can actually use that energy. The technology will determine exactly how much, where it's going to come from. But that's a huge benefit, not just because you've got accessible energy, but if you look at the regulatory filings by most utilities across Canada, what you're going to see is there's a huge need to spend an awful lot of money on the existing legacy assets if we continue to use them in the same way. But if we use them in a different way, you can save billions of dollars, or at least defer those upgrades in many ways, or even eliminate some of the smaller distribution assets simply by virtue of the fact that you've got a different form of accessible energy, but ultimately that electricity may have come from the Site C. So we have to rethink a lot of things. Technology will definitely help us get there, the integration and machine learning. But people have to get engaged in that conversation and not necessarily use old arguments to address current issues.
I want to get to another question that's on here because it actually was given a subsequent question that I want to work into the original. Very interesting because I think we're going to get some interesting perspectives on this. And that's, given that electricity currently supports substantially less than 30% of our energy use, how much land would be required to support 100% renewable energy? But a second thought that was added to that, which was land use also has a carbon cost, and is that going to be calculated into that thinking as well? So, I'm sure there's no easy answer to that because, as you've all indicated, there's a need for a mix. There's a need for geothermal, wind, solar, hydroelectric energy storage. So calculating the physical footprint of that is going to be difficult, I guess, until we really, truly can appreciate, really even in some of our northern and remote communities, what makes the most sense for energy production, I'm guessing.
I'd like to start on that question.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting question of how do we actually use the energy resources that we have in this country? How do we deploy infrastructure in that area? Right now, in Alberta, I'm going to quote Alberta because I've actually looked at that quite closely. The current electricity system uses about 600 square kilometers of land area, but the important part is that land area doesn't equal land area. So the impact of a coal-fired power plant is very, very different from a wind farm. When you have an open pit mine, you take the top layer of soil off, and then you dig out the coal underneath, and you can refurbish that area. But the environmental impact that this has on the land is very different from a wind farm. When you compare how much electricity a coal-fired power plant with an open pit mine produces versus a wind farm, well, the area impact of a coal-fired power plant is much smaller than a wind farm. But a wind farm has a different utilization of that land. You can still, use it for farming. You can use it for recreation. You can't really walk around an open pit coal mine. So that impact is very different. And once you start looking at all the different impacts of our current fossil fuel system, it actually shows that it's really hard to compare the impacts of renewables to those of fossil fuels. So there are studies on what are the edge effects of pipelines that go for long stretches of clear cut. We know that animal behavior changes along those what are called the edge effect. Along this edge effect, animals stay away from those pipelines. So that area just along the edge of the pipeline becomes virtually unusable for them. So comparing these different land area impacts is really challenging. And even though on a per square meter basis, renewable energy may require more land area to produce the same amount of electricity, those impacts are very different and can actually be better in terms of the environmental impact than that of fossil fuel. So just looking at a single raw number is a fallacy that can lead into the wrong direction.
Yeah, I might just add to that, and I appreciate that comment. Most wind farms cover a large area because you need a lot of spacing between the turbines to ensure they operate as efficiently as possible. But within that large area that's sort of circumscribed by the entire wind farm, you only use about 5% of that landmass. And the other 95% is available to, as was mentioned, to farm or to graze crop or to graze cattle or to do whatever. We did a study at the Canadian Wind Energy Association probably 15 years ago that looked at how much land would you need to produce 20% of Canada's electricity from wind. And the total amount of land that would be required at that time, and it would be less now because the turbines are better, but at that time was less than the size of Prince Edward Island to be able to do that. Now, you wouldn't do it all on Prince Edward Island, right? I mean, that's not the point. But so there's, I agree that you have to have a thoughtful discussion around land impacts in that sense. The other thing I would say, just coming back to the question, is that absolutely true, electricity is less than, it's about 20% of total energy in the country today. I don't think any of us sitting around this panel envision a scenario where electricity is 100%, right? I mean, I think we're looking at scenarios where, I think to get to where we need to go, electricity probably has to become the majority, probably has to pass 50% of total energy, but we're going to need to continue to use other forms of energy as well going forward, and we'll need to do that thoughtfully in terms of carbon considerations and climate, and that's why things like carbon capture and storage and things like that are still important sort of discussions that we need to continue with going forward.
Patrick?
So I think Kevin and Robert said many of the things that I would have said, but maybe I'll just throw two more thoughts out on the land use piece. The question included reference to GHG emissions from the land use itself. So the one thing I would say for hydropower reservoirs in Canada, because our climate is cold and because the water is typically well oxygenated, we have a much lower GHG emissions profile over the life cycle of the assets than in other parts of the world. Canadian hydropower is an ultra low GHG emissions option. And the second thing I would say is I think there's some really interesting thinking about how to make the best use of the land that we use. And there's great examples of former mines and quarries in Canada being used being proposed to be used as reservoirs for pumped storage hydro projects. And I know within Robert's sector, solar on landfills and so on and so forth, or perhaps in transmission using existing oil and gas infrastructure rights of way as well. So I think getting to 100% renewable would, I don't know if we could do it, but I think that there's some really smart things that we can do to reduce land use impacts as we move in that direction.
Keith, did you have anything you want to add? Or sorry, go ahead.
I'm not going to try to weigh in too much on the investment side or the actual application of renewable energy on land, but what I will say is about 45 years ago, I heard a statistic that said that about 90% of the population of Canada lives within 100 miles of the US border. I don't think that percentage has changed much. In fact, it may have gone up, which means we've got an awful lot of land in Canada that's accessible, and obviously environmental footprint is important. But I think it's important to ask the question, who makes those decisions over the land use? And is it land that otherwise wouldn't be used for grazing or recreation or any other purpose? We do a lot of work with Northern First Nations, for example, and they are strong proponents in many cases of building these facilities on land that either is on reserve or in the traditional territory and otherwise wouldn't be used for anything other than what it's been used for the past several million years. And so it becomes important to ask the farmer, the First Nation, the local resident, and make sure that we take into consideration their views of the land and not just look at it in aggregate and saying, it's going to take X percent of Canada. It's a very varied country, and the land uses vary extensively.
The point that I'd like to add is just for comparative purposes, in British Columbia, the current reservoir area, so those are lakes that are being used for electricity production, is about 5,000 square kilometers. the reservoir area of the new Site C dam is going to be between 90 and 100 square kilometers, just for comparison of how much land we are designating to electricity production already. And that factors into how do we make those decisions going forward. As you said, Keith, it's really a question of how's that land being used today, and do the people that that land belongs to or that live on that land, that use that land, do they support building these infrastructures?
Guys, there's a couple other questions that are in our question section, but I want to get to one other point before we get back to those. So I want to do a little bit of a scenario play here, because I think this is important for everyone to understand, which is tomorrow, the federal government comes out of nowhere and says by 2035, every vehicle on the road in Canada, light, heavy, personal, doesn't matter, 100% electric. What does the industry have to start doing? Where are we looking to develop assets? Where are we going to have a more difficult time with this? Keith, from a construction perspective, do we have the labor force? Do we have the skill sets to be able to do this? So I know you're each coming at this from a unique perspective. So this is where I'm hoping you'll be able to take this, but just give us a snapshot from where you sit in this equation, that if a major announcement was made tomorrow towards electrifying the economy, from your perspective, what needs to start happening? What are the next steps moving forward for your organization, your company, to ensure that this demand can start to be developed?
Maybe I'll lead off on that one. Starting with one of your original questions, do we have the labor force? The answer is yes, we have the labor force, but the supplement to that is no, we do not have the full skill set. There's been a lot of talk about transitioning workers, and I think sometimes we should be asking the workers a little bit more, but nonetheless, we've got enough human resource to be able to execute this work across the country, but currently many of them are occupied doing other things. So there's a significant and extensive training program necessary. But more important than that, we have to look at the infrastructure as a whole, because electrification requires a number of different things. It requires manufacturing, it requires charging stations that aren't going to impede the economy, which means different technology has to be deployed. It means something has to provide the electricity to those charging stations in the first place. And if you're going to have that nationally done, then you've got to be considering not just Toronto and Vancouver, you've got to be thinking about Estevan and Timmins and a variety of different places that don't necessarily have the same build out or access to the infrastructure. So I guess the one thing that I would say has to be done is clear and certain direction from government, from the corporate world, in terms of who's going to be funding this and who's going to be regulating this. Because until those questions are answered, it's going to be a very big challenge.
And just quickly on your education note, I just to give some credit to where it's due from something I was reading the other day, the University of Alberta has developed a course for addressing the shortage in renewable energy technology professionals that is a course targeting people who are already in, say, the oil and gas sector, and transitioning them over with a course load that you can do while still working full-time in the industry. So something more along the lines of that, taking the lead from University of Alberta on that certainly sounds like a good starting point, because it sounds like they're starting to address this very issue.
It really does. And I think if we look back in history, prior to the first wind farm or the first turbine being erected in Canada, we didn't have a workforce that was capable and skilled at doing that. Now we do. So it's definitely possible, and the workforce at large will respond to market demand, but that demand has to be clear, because people are going to have a tough time changing their career course for something that's fleeting.
Right.
I can try and add something too. I think that the commitment like that's an announcement that's made like that will necessitate sort of a massive sort of amount of activity and investment. And I think on the generation side, that would be in some ways the area of least concern, I would think, because there are many generating options that are available, and there are projects that are ready to go, and all this sort of stuff. I don't mean that. I would be more concerned about infrastructure, which we've talked about in terms of charging stations and things like that, but also how this will be managed at the level of the distribution system within the electricity sector. And we have, you know, in many areas, this is one example of it, but in many areas, I would often argue that the barriers to moving forward are not technology barriers. Primarily, there are technologies we still need to develop and things like this, but they're more often regulatory barriers or market barriers that actually prevent us from putting these technologies in place. And I think that would be the biggest challenge to overcome in terms of meeting a commitment like that. It's, you know, it's sort of, I'll use one example. If you think about, you know, the introduction of solar photovoltaics and people putting them on their roofs, you know, there's you know, we have the technology, we can do it. In many places, there's still just a whole bunch of regulatory barriers that make it really complicated for somebody to try and do that impose additional costs and things like that, so we don't actually benefit from that technology. And I think those are the challenges that I think system operators and utilities in particular are really wrestling with now, because the world is changing so fast from a technology perspective and from a policy perspective. I really do think they're having a hard time keeping up, frankly, and not out of negative intentions. It's just there's a lot going on, and there's a, you know, it was mentioned earlier. I mean, some of the changes we're talking about are really fundamental. We have to rethink the whole thing in terms of how we're dealing with electricity compared to what we were doing just 10, 15 years ago. And we haven't got a lot of time to do it. So I think that's where the bigger challenge is.
Okay. Patrick?
I agree a lot with Robert and Keith, and you know, maybe just to add another thought would be it's going to be very difficult for one small village to achieve that goal. It's going to be a little bit easier for a small town, a big town, a city. Canada really needs to begin to work at the regional level for energy planning more. So I think on day one, the leaders of provinces and other groupings of regions need to work together to consider what the competitive advantages of each are, what the complementarities are, and what needs to happen to make sure that we optimize and take full advantage of those synergies.
Kevin, anything you want to add?
Yeah, if the government of Canada came out and said we want to electrify the entire economy, what I would like to see is not just a simple goal stated, but a pathway to get there. And that means comprehensive support on each individual technology level. So as an example I gave earlier, the heating system, the fossil fuel heating system in British Columbia uses about an amount of energy that's equivalent to 1/3 of our annual electricity production. If we say we have to electrify, if we mandate that and everybody implements just baseboard heating, because that is by far the cheapest option to just meet that standard of electrifying, then we are going to need to build renewable energy assets that produce that 1/3 of electricity additionally. But if we put policies in place that support the build out of energy efficiency measures and heat pumps, then we can actually reduce that energy demand considerably. We can probably cut it in half, maybe more, which means that we don't need to build those additional energy assets. And we've been, just one point I'd like to add, we've been throwing this word clean electricity or clean energy around, and I'm trying to avoid using that word because there is no such thing as clean energy. The only clean energy is the energy that you don't use. Every kind of energy infrastructure has an impact on the environment, on society, and we need to recognize that just throwing a technological fix at this climate change problem isn't going to be the solution that is going to help us actually meet that target.
I would just, if I could just add one comment to what Patrick said, which is when he talked about the regional side. I mean, one of the big challenges we face in Canada, quite frankly, is the balkanization of electricity planning in this country. And we spend a lot of time in this country trying to optimize 10 different sort of provincial electricity systems. And the one thing that guarantees is that if you look at it from a national basis, it's guaranteed to be suboptimal. And that's really what's happened. And we do need to find ways, especially when we're looking at the sort of scale of change that we're talking about, the speed with which that change needs to occur. We need to capitalize on our strengths and find those synergies. And that does require a level of regional collaboration that I think historically hasn't been there. And that we need to step up and really work on. And I think there's some limited signs in that regard, particularly in Atlantic Canada, I think, but we've got a long way to go to make that work yet.
As we talk about the fact that, the assets that we will need in order to be able to meet that, potential electrification, there is one asset of significance that is looking like it's going to be wrapped up, which is the Pickering nuclear plant. And I know none of you are necessarily nuclear experts, but at the same time, we're talking about, Ontario that has, its significant demand, and yet, we're shutting down a key asset in that energy mix. And I'm just wondering, from an opinion perspective, as we look at what could potentially be in our short-term future, where we have a federal government that is pointing us down a road towards greater electrification of parts of Canada, is this the time for a province to be shutting down a major energy asset just because? Well, I'm not going to be pretending to be the expert as to why they're doing it, but is this really a time where we want to be looking at shelving a significant energy asset that has the potential to meet what we see as part of the future electrification needs? Keith, I see your head nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. On the surface, if you were to be talking to your neighbor over the backyard fence, the answer would be clearly not. But I think it's important to know, and Patrick and Robert have both mentioned this earlier on, the investment required for a legacy asset, it's very significant to construct, but it's also very, very significant over time to refurbish. And I know that there are a number of nuclear facilities around the world that are staring this problem right in the face right now, because we're not talking about a few million or even a few hundred million. We're talking about billions or tens of billions of dollars just to refurbish one nuclear facility. So the question then becomes, would that money be better spent replacing that generation with something else? Or is it better spent putting it back into the same, in some cases, 1970s or earlier technology that you can upgrade somewhat, but the fundamentals of a nuclear facility don't really change unless you bulldoze the entire thing and build a new one to take advantage of today's technology. So there are no easy answers, but I think the people and those that I do know in the nuclear industry are they're thoughtful, and they don't take decisions like this lightly. I would suspect that there are a very clear set of reasons why that would be shut down, and it's very likely to do with the output of a lot of money, and they have to evaluate should that be better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, as you just said, I mean, Bruce Power and OPG Darlington, $25.8 billion to refurbish those two assets. And then, you've also got New Brunswick that is facing a similar question with one of their nuclear plants. So very interesting. Don't know, does anyone else want to jump in? Robert, Patrick, Kevin, with thoughts on that?
Well, I think just to say that, I mean, there's whether it's a decision to shut down something because of policy or regulation or because of economics, at the end of the day, I think that what's going to be increasingly important going forward is to clearly define what are the services that asset provided. And Patrick made a very good sort of statement earlier about how, within electricity, we're talking about a whole range of services and values that are provided by these technologies. And I think it's just going to be very clear when decisions like this are taken that those are clearly defined such that, again, there are opportunities to consider out of the full range of options available, what is the most effective and efficient way to sort of supply those values going forward. And I think that, again, this is an area where in Ontario is going through a very significant, led by the independent electricity system operator, a very significant process of market renewal and market reform. Where they're starting to reflect on, okay, well, within the market, maybe we do have to more clearly differentiate between these different services. And we do have to allow for competition to provide each of these different services going forward. And that fundamental restructuring, again, comes back to sending signals into the market about how you could go. And I'll use an example from renewables. For 15 years, wind energy providers have just focused on providing energy into the grid. They weren't really concerned about providing ancillary services because there was no either request for them to do so or no market for them to play in. These technologies can actually provide a number of ancillary services with relatively modest investment in the technologies if there was a market to do so. And so this is the kind of discussion that's happening now. Well, let's more clearly define what we need so that we can get the best possible solutions to that. And I think that's going to be a key consideration when looking to replace an asset or, frankly, in building new assets going forward.
Gentlemen, we've got about 10 minutes left in our conversation. There's one quick point that I want to make sure that we touch on before we wrap things up, which is innovation. We've touched on in the solar and wind sector to see how, the evolving technologies have increased power production and efficiency on that end. But looking at some of the emerging technologies, we're seeing, Alberta has now laid the framework for increased use of geothermal, but we're also looking at battery storage systems, energy storage systems. So I'm wondering, one of the questions we had was any thoughts about liquid air as a battery system? And I'm just wondering, is there a technology or is there a place where we should be focusing our efforts when it comes to innovation for the energy sector? Once again, knowing what could be down the pipeline as far as the future need for electricity and electrifying the economy in Canada.
I'll start with a short thing, which is to say, I don't think it's a matter of focusing on a technology. I think it's a matter of focusing on an outcome and defining it. And technologies will compete to provide or to service that outcome.
Yeah, I would agree. Go ahead.
After you, Keith.
Okay, I would agree with that. The technology, once again, look back in history, even in current day, the technology will emerge when the market demands it or is ready for it. Whether it's iPhones, whether it's artificial intelligence is going to figure out how to charge your electric car and when. There are a variety of different things. So I'm not too worried about the technology coming out. As Robert mentioned, there's a lot of it that's already there. It's more a matter of how is it best deployed, who's going to deploy it. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about significantly would be the increase in third-party investment, primarily because you've got some ESG policies by a lot of large corporations, pension funds, that kind of thing, that have significant amounts of money that they want to deploy in this. It's not a matter of just saying, what's the best investment? It's a matter of saying, we want to invest in renewable energy. And being able to tap into that, I think, is critical because, the tax base does have limitations. And I think that private money can be, in some cases, more efficiently spent when they've got some skin in the game. So that's something we have to take a look at. But the technology itself, it's actually stunning when you take a look at what's happening on the grid level front and the grid edge front. It's amazing what's actually available even today, let alone what's going to be available tomorrow. So the efficiencies that Kevin mentioned earlier are tantamount to the industrial revolution. I know that sounds like a sweeping large statement, but I don't think it's overstated either. In order to go down this road of electrification, you need to be able to use the technology that's available. And a lot of that is not something we've used in the past, but it is available. So if you look at some of the most efficient electrical grids around the world, you're going to find that almost all of them, if not all of them, have deployed technology in a far more significant way than we have so far.
Thank you. Patrick?
I'll maybe just add that around the world, as part of green recovery plans, we've seen some very ambitious hydrogen plays. And I expect that we'll see a national strategy from the federal government for hydrogen very soon. So, I mean, I think if we're thinking about innovation in one small thing, we've said already that we've got more than enough renewable energy to develop a lot more generation in the years ahead. using that renewable electricity or clean electricity for electrolysis to produce hydrogen from water, which is called green hydrogen, is a big opportunity and something that Canada is very well positioned to do. And one thing that's very key to driving down our cost of green hydrogen is the electrolyzer, that component that drives the electrolysis. So that's just one interesting area where I think Canada's R&D community have an opportunity to make advancements which would have very global significance. But also a lot of energy companies have opportunities for RD&D projects to begin to get more experience in Canada with that kind of project.
Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add to Robert's comment or support Robert's comment that we need a system perspective rather than focusing on a single technology. I'm privileged that I get to read about the newest technology almost on a daily basis, and there's so much information coming out that it's really challenging to keep up with. And for us to go ahead and say we're going to pick this technology, again, we're locking ourselves in, and I don't think we're good at picking a certain technology. What we need to do is support a broad range of perspectives of how we can get to the targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that doesn't just include technology, but that includes understanding how our society wants to function in the future. We see that with our current pandemic right now. Electricity demand has gone down. We're seeing that people are taking fewer flights, and probably a lot of that demand is going to pick up again once we once we get a handle on this pandemic. But we've shown that our society can, adjust to these kinds of external forces. And if we can have the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the back of our heads moving forward, then that's a better approach than trying to say we're going to choose this technology and invest all our money in that.
Perfect. Well, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. So Robert, Patrick, Kevin, Keith, thank you so very much for joining us for today's conversation. I really appreciate a very, very fascinating discussion. I'm looking forward to writing the summary of this one, because I tell you, there's a lot of great information that should be shared with a lot of people who, let's be honest, should have been sitting in on this great conversation to begin with. So thank you to all four of you very, very much for joining us today. I greatly appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So just to wrap up, a few quick notes that I want to make sure that I pass along. First of all, to those of you who want to review this discussion or be able to show it to members of your own team, don't forget that within a few short hours, this conversation will once again be available to be able to watch on demand at this very link. You don't need to go somewhere else. We'll have it available here. And then after about a month after that, we'll put it as part of our actual media editorial channel. Don't forget, of course, the InfraIntelligence discussion series happens on the fourth Thursday morning of every single month. November 26th will be our next conversation, where we'll discuss the U.S. election and its impact on Canadian infrastructure development. Not one you'll want to miss. Also, if you head over to renewcanada.net and click on the link for the InfraIntelligence discussion series, you'll see our proposed lineup for conversations from January to June of 2021. Of course, if you yourself have an idea for a conversation, don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time. Thank you so very much for joining us today. If you have any questions, don't forget I can be reached, andrew@actualmedia.ca. Feel free to email me at any time, any questions you have about today's conversation, a future conversation, or something that you think is worthy of a future discussion. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next InfraIntelligence event on November 26th. Thanks so much. Have a great day.